CLG, Counter Logic Gaming, are an organization who, at this point in time, do not have the genetic makeup of a contender in League of Legends. They don't have the DNA as an organization to be able to bring forth a championship team that might win NA LCS, might do some deep run at Worlds. And it's actually something which is crossing over, thanks to some of the reasons, into other games as well. In CSGO and League of Legends, two of the biggest esports, they don't have top-level teams, even in their regions, never mind internationally. Now, the reason why this is significant and why people will think this means this video is like a diss on CLG or it's some kind of downplay of who they are as an org is because obviously the expectation for the name CLG is that it should be one of the biggest in the world. It should be important. It's the same expectation that exists for the Knicks in basketball. People think, well, it's not enough that the Knicks don't even make the playoffs, don't go far. They should be championship level team. They should be contending for titles. They should be able to get the players, get the coaches, get the team together and the culture together to be champions like they were in the 70s, contenders like they were in the 90s. And so when they're not able to, people are very harsh about the New York Knicks. But the difference is the New York Knicks do still have that big market. They do have the money. They do have the DNA. They do have a place people want to go. They can get star players. And so it is unforgivable when they don't succeed. Actually, the spin here, the counterintuitive element is, as I'm going to outline, CLG is actually doing very well as an org relative to what they're working with. But let's look at that history in League of Legends to see why the expectation is that they should be up there with the Cloud9s and TSMs of the world. So in League of Legends, traditionally, CLG was always a top 2 team. For the first couple of years through to 2012, like the middle of 2012, they were always top 2. They were either the best in the first couple of years, then TSM eventually overtook them in 2012 for good, and then they were the second best. And then, yes, in 2012, teams started to challenge them, the Dignitases of the world, Curse. But overall, CLG generally was still considered the second best. By the end of 2012, they were still having decent results internationally and domestically where you could say they were second best in NA. Then you come into the LCS era. And remember, the LCS era started with the big 4. This was TSM, CLG, Curse, and Dignitas. And generally in that order. Maybe you could have put Dignitas before, but they'd had some issues at the end of 2012. And you have to say, of those 4, for the first couple of years, for the first like 2 or 3 splits at least, CLG was tied with Dignitas as the worst of the big 4. Curse had their times where they'd had big semi-finals runs. Obviously, they potentially could have won the first split, but didn't. TSM was way out ahead as the best. They're making all the finals. Obviously, in the meantime, Cloud9 came up and actually overtook most of those teams, and everyone except TSM and had overtaken TSM for a period of time. And so they were doing quite badly already at that time when the expectations were that they should do well. Now, yeah, they had a brief spike under Monty, where obviously they finished 3rd in the spring split of Season 4, and then a time in the summer split of that year, they were doing very well and they were top of the league, but they obviously didn't manage to hold strong in that respect and they failed hard in the playoffs. Then the next year, after overcoming some coaching changes, getting Link out of the lineup, they had their success with Doublelift in the first split. Then they had their success the split afterwards, which was kind of the clusterfuck split. That was the one where TSM had Yellow Star and seemed very confused in terms of the coaching and didn't manage to win the league. But even then, CLG only won narrowly in the semis in the final, but they managed to win NA LCS again. Obviously had the great MSI performance and had a pretty solid run to Worlds overall, even though they had a bit of a letdown at times in the summer split that year. They are not a contender now and have not been ever since basically MSI ended in 2016. They have not been a real contending team who could have actually won an LCS if you look at them, how the games played out and the expectations before they played those playoff series. And the problem is, it's actually not on the horizon that they're going to legitimately contend for the title, even with Dardoch, who's a star player and someone who's not taken an import slot, and so you could really build around. Right now, the lineup that they have probably shouldn't be in the NLCS final. It would be a surprise if they did. It would be unexpected. Yes, they have potential and they have more of a ceiling now, but it's not anyone's expectation right now that they're going to go and they're going to contend with TSM and contend with Cloud9 and be the best NA team. At the moment, being the best team is just unrealistic for this CLG. But that is because the expectations are borne out so much from the history of CLG and past expectations that they're unrealistic. The expectations for CLG are mismatched for who they are as an org right now. They're doing quite well for what they are as an org right now. The resources they have, the current history they have, the current lineup they have, and where they're situated in the NA ecosystem. So you think about where they are as an org in terms of backing, finances, resources to spend on these things. So season 3, they had some of the best resources in the scene. Now, admittedly, they'd had the hit from the own scenario and they had to recoup their sponsors, but they still had pretty good money, especially when you consider LCS was pretty dry at the time for good sponsorships and good amounts of money. A lot of teams using that stipend and really needing it. So they were in a good situation back then, but not doing well in the league. Then season 4 came around, they were still pretty good. They were up there. They weren't anywhere near the best, but they were up there in terms of finances still, and they had some decent results at times there. Season 5, they were already falling way behind. Now you start to get more investment coming. Now the bigger teams had managed to parlay their sponsorships, etc., into much bigger. And so actually it's impressive that they managed to win LCS, that they had some decent success ultimately. Season 6, already, you have to look at that season and say, what a bang-up job that org did to be able to get those results, because they were way behind in terms of investment. You'd already had the LMQs, and by this point in time, Immortals coming in the league, and Team Liquid, and all these people are taking investment, have got massive money, are paying huge salaries, are getting star players, getting imports, getting acknowledged star players, and CLG is working with the same core, and they're working with their lesser budget and less investment, and they don't have the same name even at this point in time, even though they were already champions. They hadn't got the same culture of winning there. And so coming into season 7, now they've regressed in terms of results back to where they probably should be as an org, or actually doing slightly better. Like, you look at them right now, they're behind most orgs in the league. There are tons of orgs that have taken investment and got a lot of money and can pay massive salaries and make big player signings, even when they're not good teams. Echo Fox has Froggen. Now, this is a guy who could be on a top 3 NA team if you wanted to just go for the team in terms of results, but he's getting paid megabucks playing for Echo Fox. So CLG is able to outplace most of the league still, and yet they're in a position where they're not one of the big orgs in that respect. So they're still performing well. It's just that season 6 was an overperformance in that sense. The team brought that success forwards. The org itself couldn't create and engineer that success the same way, even though we still give credit to people like Zix, etc., for who they chose in terms of the players that they made. They made shrewd choices. They couldn't make superstar signings and then have success off that, though. Now, you look at it, it's fairly obvious as to why this is. A lot of the economical aspects is purely that CLG doesn't have the big backing. They don't have those huge investors. Dignitas has the 76ers. NRG has the Sacramento Kings owners. They have Shaq. They have A-Rod. Team Liquid obviously took on Golden State Warriors. The Immortals guys have Lionsgate, the movie studio. They have the co-owner of the Memphis Grizzlies. They have some of the people behind Linkin Park. All these orgs out there, there's many more than that, taken on massive investment. Obviously, people like NRG are actually failed outright and just left the league entirely. Cloud9's even taken millions of dollars in investment. CLG has not. They continue to work with what they've got, try and get the most out of what they've got, have to pay reasonable salaries, good salaries, but nowhere close to the exorbitant salaries, nowhere close to the Reign over to Team Liquid salaries, to Huni and Immortals, to Bjergson, nowhere close to these kinds of salaries. And you have to judge them accordingly to that. Yes, we want to just look at the players, but the point is they can't just go out there and sign some superstar in the same way that these other guys can. That's the problem, is that with CLG, they had their success from this org, and they saw the ceiling of this org, this team rather, within the org in League of Legends, and now the prospect of making a big name player signing, it's very slim the chances that they can do that in League of Legends right now. Like, can they get elite players? Can they get world-class Koreans? No, they couldn't do it. It's very unlikely unless that player just happened to want to go to the team for some bizarre reason. But in terms of market value, those players get paid way too much. They get very exorbitant salaries, by the way. Some of them are massively overpaid not in terms of the market value, but in terms of how people are willing to have bidding wars to get these guys. So they couldn't even, in theory, get a player like Flame to Immortals. That's out of their price range. So he's not even an elite player right now. So it's very unlikely you're going to see big name signings to turn it around for CLG, especially no Koreans. None that just want the money and want to come to the West for the Skrilla and be on a team and get paid very well despite not having success. They also, unfortunately, despite winning those 2 LCS championships and back-to-back and having a run to the final of MSI, all incredibly significant stuff, don't have a winning tradition, unfortunately. They don't have a team like TSM where people know it doesn't really matter what happened last season and what happened at the international event. Somehow TSM will get it back together, same with Cloud9, and get back to the top again and make the moves that they need to get back to the top. CLG doesn't have that tradition, and in fact, they don't chop and change as much as those teams and don't have that win-at-all-costs mentality that some of those teams do. I mean, I actually have a lot of respect for Cloud9, in as much as I think Rush is one of the best talents NA region has ever been allowed to have play for their teams. But yeah, he was having some issues in Cloud9 that first split, and so they could have stuck with him. They, in theory, without the residency change, they could have gone for the super team with a impact, and they didn't. They said, you know what, he's a fantastic player, let's just make him a streamer, or let's not have him in the lineup, or let's put him over on another team. They were actually willing to do those hard changes. I don't think a CLG would actually. I think they would just stick by the player, and they'd wait 3 or 4 seasons to see what happened before they thought about a big change. But then again, they also don't have the money to make the big changes that some of these other orgs do. So right now, the only orgs that really have a winning tradition in NA are Cloud9 and TSM, really. There's no one beyond that. They're also a team, as I kind of say, who won't take risks. Now, they won't take risks in terms of cutting players, but more than that, one area I will criticize them in is when people meme about the power of friendship and stuff, they have put, I think, an undue emphasis on that. I think it's good. I think if you can have 2 or 3 players in a team who are cool guys, who are down to earth, very rational, who get along with people, that's great. But sometimes, especially in a team like this, where you're lacking, for my money, a bit of firepower, a bit of star power, that's when I think you have to sometimes, in a position that CLG as an org's in, take a gamble on someone who has a difficult personality to work with, who has been rejected by the teams, but whose skill, as a result, is actually overqualified. He's much better than a player of the level that you could get normally. That's the point. For someone like CLG, since you can't afford the big name signings, you can't just go and get the superstar who's got everything great about him and who can deliver right now. If you want the firepower, you've got to take chances on the player who the only reason he's available for you is because despite all his talent and his firepower, he's got something else a little bit wrong. He's got something that needs to be aligned with the right sort of teammates, or needs to develop through and work through and mature from, or a little thing that needs to be tweaked via coaching. And so the ultimate example of this is when CLG on multiple occasions didn't make the move to bring in Forgiven when he was trying out for them, when he would have joined them. I know from talking to him, he would have done these moves and they could have had a literal Western superstar in their team at cut price offer as well, not going for the highest amount of money, and they would have had a that's like a rocket you aim in a direction and let it fucking go. They really could have had that. I'll give them credit that I think taking Dardoch in this respect is a step in the right direction. I think that's a good example of doing it, but it's a rare example for this team and they rarely do it, because the whole point is Forgiven and Dardoch, it is their personality, the difficult part about them, which is why they're even available to you as CLG as an org now for that price. And so yes, you can't just take all these offers, you can't put 5 of these players in your team and have all these problem people, but just like in the past, like a classic example is when the Bulls went from being a very good team to being one of the best teams of all time by taking Dennis Rodman on, a fantastic rebounder in the NBA in the 90s, but who had an incredibly difficult personality. And yes, you know what? Phil Jackson was one of the only coaches, along with his early coach, Chuck Daly, who ever got through to him and ever managed to work with him. And that was a very difficult kind of riddle to solve. But in solving it and getting that player, as a result, not for necessarily the biggest wage in the league, they were able to become champions as a result. And so I feel like that's where CLG has to take a little bit more aggressive moves, a little bit more risk if they want to make it as this type of an org right now, because it's going to have to come from the players being fantastic. You can't just buy the players in that particular respect. I think in general, another issue they have is they don't have superstar players in the team already, which would attract other players. Forget the winning tradition. Players love, in a way, to bandwagon. They love to play with other great players. They want to play with a player better than them, and then they feel like their chances to succeed go up. So yes, there was a period last year, a period 2 years ago especially, where Aframu was the best support in NA, and he was a very, very good support. He was a great captain, and that could have attracted some people. That would have attracted a Forgiven, etc. But they blew their chance there. He's still a good player, but he's not near as monumental a figure as he was before. He's not near as good at his position relative to all his peers in NA LCS as he was before, and he never played a carry role anyway. So he was never that monster carry that people want to play with in that respect, like they do with a Bjergsen or a Jensen, etc. Then you got to look at the fact that because of all these factors, realistically, CLG right now, as an org, is a mid to lower half of NA LCS org. That's where they should be placing. They should be just making playoffs and going out first round, or they should be just missing playoffs. That's where they are as an org in terms of finances and the tradition they've got in their team at the moment, beyond the old school name value, etc. And that's something where I feel like they actually are outperforming. Their team's doing better than that. And I think, by the way, as an actual org in terms of staff, I think they have a good bunch of staff there. I think Hotshot did a very smart move when he finally delegated all the responsibilities for some of the key elements to other people. They seem like they've done a good job, certainly in terms of coaching. I think on this team, I would put the highest price tag of anyone on Ziggs. I think he is worth his weight in gold, because despite being a lower level team in terms of finances and resources, they've got one of the best coaches in the league, and consistently someone who's shown himself to be one of the best coaches and has been able to work with, at times, lesser talents and get a lot out of them and get a lot out of his team and adapt his team to whatever the current meta was. So I think if he was to leave, even if they kept the same lineup, they'd run into a lot of problems. They'd have a much less consistent level of performance. And yes, if they got a fantastic coach somehow, maybe they could have a higher trajectory in some way, but I doubt it. I think that's actually something where, as an org, I think their staff has done a very good job in terms of efficiency for what they've got to work with, and the players they've got to work with. They've done a great job. They've done a fantastic job bringing through talents like Stixay, making players like who could have been discarded by many teams and would have, in fact, after initial problems. They've done a great job in getting a lot out of them. Problem is they've gotten a lot out of them, and now there's not much more you can do right there, and there's no miracle you can work with those players. So I actually feel like at the moment they're not a giant as an org in CSGO or League of Legends. So at the moment, I think a realistic expectation for CLG is like in the NBA or the NHL or whatever, it's those small market teams that have to do a great job. They have to be very efficient, and that's where they can get success from. They have to find a good player, but who's a young player that people overlooked, and bring him into the lineup like they did with Stixay, and then have a chance to get more value out of his position relative to what you paid for him and what it cost than what you would otherwise. They have to be able to get a star player who's a little bit wonky and who has some issues, but you put him with the right players and suddenly he blossoms and he comes through and becomes very good. They can't just sign a top 5 player and bring him over to the team. I mean, the best example of what you can hope for if you're CLG is to be like the 90s and 2000s Indiana Pacers, because they were a team where, yeah, in theory, they're not like a small market to the same degree. They are a small market team compared to LA and New York, etc. But obviously, they have a good tradition there of basketball in Indiana, but they're a team that didn't ever have a lot of money. And so they used to have a GM, and he is my model for the great GM, because his teams never won the championship. They were rarely ever the best. They only made the finals once. They had a bunch of like conference finals runs. But part of the reason why they're amazing is if you looked at the resources that he was working with, this guy who was the GM was a guy called Donnie Walsh. He later on went to the Knicks, but James Dolan, the old owner of the Knicks, fucked all that up and didn't let him do half the shit he wanted to do and ruined half of his deals. And this guy was an expert at making efficient deals. So he would do very, very smart deals. If he signed a star player or a good player, he would only do it if the deal made sense. He would only do it if the amount of money you're paying relative to what you're getting from him, you're not overpaying, you're not being outbidded, people aren't driving up the bidding price elsewhere, and therefore you're just signing out of desperation. And famously, that's what happened when he went to the Knicks. James Dolan basically told him under all circumstances, sign Carmelo Anthony. Even though at the time, the deal in terms of what you gave up to the Nuggets at the time did not make sense. You should not have done that deal then. You should have held off and either let him go elsewhere because it wasn't the right deal, or you should have waited and hoped you could renegotiate later. And instead, they didn't. They got him, and that's half of what fucked up Carmelo's career and the Knicks, is that they tossed away way too many pieces to get him at that point. So you got to make the smart deals. And likewise, you've got to know when to sell people. That's the other part of being efficient. So if you get a player who becomes incredibly good, who becomes better than you can afford, essentially, in terms of retaining him, sometimes you've got to let him go, because that's how you run efficiently in your team. Even though he's a good player and your heart says, I don't want to let him go, you've got to be able to do that. So I feel like that's where CLG has to be and where they have to operate. And we have to readjust our expectations to where they are as an org now, because they're not a contenders org right now. Maybe they can be, and maybe they will be in terms of getting the right players and then getting lucky or getting fortuitous in terms of which players develop and how well they play. And maybe Dardoch will be so good that it'll make them able to contend for the title. But as an org, they don't have the DNA of an org that can contend.